This episode of the Michael Shermer Show is brought to you by Everything Everywhere. I'm not speaking metaphorically. That's the title of a popular podcast that I really enjoy. Everything Everywhere. And they really mean it. The host is Gary Arndt. He's one of the most interesting people you'll ever meet. Remember that TV commercial guy? The most interesting man in the world. Gary Arndt is that guy. In real life. In 2007, he sold his house and took all his money and started traveling the world. He's been to all 7 continents. He's been to all 50 U.S. states. He's been to hundreds and hundreds of UNESCO heritage sites. And he's tried just a lot of adventurous things that mostly I would not do because I'm a little more risk averse, let's just say. He did bungee jumping in New Zealand. He floated in the Dead Sea. Oh, I did do that one. He crossed the Arctic Circle in the Yukon. He rode a Formula One race car at 180 miles an hour. Swam with whale sharks in Australia. Went spelunking in Borneo. Swam with jellyfish in Palau. And on and on and on. You should see this list of crazy things this guy has done. That's what makes his podcast so interesting, because every day for 10 to 15 minutes, he just grabs a topic and just gives you the short lowdown on it, and you get to just learn something new every day. This is what I do. I just cue it up when I'm going to take my dog for a walk, or I'm driving somewhere, or I'm just doing a short workout at the gym or something like that, doing chores. Just, it's amazing how much free time you actually have in the day when you're just doing something else, and you can just pop in the earbuds, cue up Everything Everywhere, and let Gary tell you about something new. For example, here's some interesting topics he's had recently. Jackie Robinson, The Legend of Bigfoot, one of my favorites because that's one of our topics. Planet X. There's always been these speculations about Planet X. What is it exactly? Why can't they find it? The Vestal Virgins. The Easter controversy. Jet propulsion. The cult of Pythagoras. The unbelievable life of Adrian Carton de Weert. This guy is so interesting. I mean, most of these topics I know nothing about. And so it's such a great way to learn something new every day. So check it out. Podcast is Everything Everywhere. It's available on any of your popular podcast or preferred formats or venues. And Gary Arndt is one of the most interesting people you will ever meet. All right, check it out. Here's our episode. My guest is my returning champion, Christof Koch. He's a neuroscientist at the Allen Institute and at the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation. He's the former president of the Allen Institute for Brain Science and a former professor at the California Institute of Technology, which is where we met. Author of 4 previous titles, including The Feeling of Life Itself, Why Consciousness is Widespread but Can't Be Computed, Consciousness, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist, and The Quest for Consciousness, a Neurobiological Approach. He writes regularly for a range of media, including Scientific American. He lives in the Pacific Northwest. Here is the new book. Just finished it. Then I Am Myself, the World, What Consciousness Is and How to Expand It. Christof, nice to see you.
Hello, Michael. Thanks for having me. It's been a while since we last talked.
Yeah, it was for your previous book. And
Yes.
I guess you haven't solved the hard problem of consciousness, because I see you had to pay David Chalmers a case of wine. What kind of wine was it? How much did that cost you?
Madeira. It was from 1988.
Oh, wow. My God.
Yeah, it was a good wine. Well, I lost the bet fair and square, so you got to pay up.
What would be the hit criteria for that you won? What would be the measure of that?
The measure would be if there's sort of a consensus among most scientists. You're never going to get uniformity, but if most scientists admit that, yes, we understand which bits and pieces of the brain are the substrate for, let's see, what we hear right now, the voices we have in our head, that would be some sort of consensus. But as became apparent last year on the stage at NYU, where I admitted I lost the bet, was we don't even agree whether the substrate of consciousness is in the front of the brain that's associated with intelligence, the prefrontal cortex in particular, or whether it's in the back of the cortex. It's more associated with seeing and hearing and touching and wanting and willing.
Okay, well, I'm not sure how you can do that. Let me rephrase it to see if I've even got the problem correctly stated. The so-called easy problem of consciousness would be tracking down the neural correlates of consciousness, which you've spent your entire career doing. Neuroscientists like you have done an amazing job figuring out how the wiring works. The hard problem, that is, what it's like to be something, consciousness, what it's like to be something. Is it like asking what it's like to actually be the wiring, the neural networks?
Well, first of all, you're adopting Chalmers language, which I'm a bit more reluctant to adopt this language.
Okay.
It is indeed, I mean, consciousness, what does Dave Chalmers mean? Dave Chalmers means that, you know, if you look at the brain and you point to a particular part of the brain, you say, this part of the brain is responsible for your feeling of love or hate or desire or seeing or hearing. Then it's not all apparent why this and not that. I mean, where's the difference? Why would any piece of physical matter, you know, the brain is a piece of furniture of the universe like any other piece. Why would this particular piece of matter give rise to consciousness but not that? Or if you point to a particular function, if you say it's broadcasting, well, then if I broadcast information, does it mean suddenly becomes conscious to all of humanity? Or if you point to a particular feature like 40 hertz, you may remember with Francis Crick, we hypothesized many years ago that 40 hertz is one of the brain signature of consciousness. That may still be right. But again, that gives rise to the question, well, why not 42? Why not 30? Why not 20? What is it particular about the number 40? So that's the hard problem. The easy problem is, as you point out, saying, well, it is an empirical fact that if you lose this part of the brain, you will not be conscious. And this is something that in principle can be addressed by science and will solve it sooner or later. And it'll be of great utility for the clinic to determine whether people who have lost consciousness, are they truly unconscious or are they just unresponsive? So that's the difference. You know, in one case, you try to squeeze the juice. You take the brain and try to squeeze the juice of consciousness, you know, out of the brain. And that, I think, is very, very hard if you start with the physical, if you start with the brain. The problem is very different if you start with consciousness and then go from consciousness to the world, rather than taking the world or a piece of it, like the brain, and trying to go to consciousness.
Yeah. Well, let me come at it a slightly different way. So what it's like to be a bat paper, what it's like to be a dolphin here, since I'm in Santa Barbara. We swim with the dolphins here. You know, it would be fun to be a dolphin. Maybe I could get one of those giant single fins to put both feet in and shave my body and have a snorkel and I don't know what, and kind of get like an echolocation system going. I'd have some kind of sense of what it's like, but I'm still a human, just kind of emulating what it would like to be a dolphin. To actually be a dolphin, I would not be a human inside the dolphin brain. It seems like it's a conceptual problem. That is, like Dan Dennett's Cartesian theater, as if the little homunculus mini-me in my head can go over into the head of the dolphin and go, oh, look at the screen. That's what it looks like to be a dolphin. That there's no such screen. There's just the experience of being a dolphin if you're a dolphin, not a human tiptoeing over there to see what it's like.
Yes, that's entirely true. It's even more obvious when I try to imagine being Michael Shermer, right? What it is like to be Mike Shermer. I can sort of imagine knowing something about your biography, having spoken with you before, but it's all indirect, it's all inferential. In the final analysis, I don't really know how you feel like or how anyone else feels like. That's a tragedy of consciousness not being universal. We don't access the universal mentality, but we have a consciousness that seems to be closely associated with our brains, and I don't directly experience your consciousness, and you don't directly experience mine, which makes this problem more challenging than to study black holes or viruses or even brains, because they all have, what people call third-person objective properties, right? You can put it on a scale and you can probe it with electrodes or with other bits and pieces of molecular machinery to study its constituents. But to know what it feels like from the inside, you have to be that system. And of course, you never are that system. You're another system.
Yeah. But on the other hand, I have a sense of what it's like to be you. You and I are both humans. We're mammals. We have nervous systems that work pretty much the same. So if I see you expressing emotions that I've experienced, it seems reasonable, if we use a Copernican principle, that I'm not special and that you're probably feeling the same thing I'm feeling. That's a reasonable inference, even if I can't prove it. In the same way, I might infer that chimpanzees or elephants grieve when they lose a loved one.
Entirely correct. Yeah, I think that's the most rational one. I cannot logically prove that you're conscious, but based on the Copernican principle, it's extremely likely that you're also. And then we can extend that to dogs and cats and animals, right? Given the similarity of a dolphin brain to your brain, they're also mammals. If I give you a little bit and piece of a dolphin brain or dog brain or monkey or human brain, no one but an expert, armed with a microscope can tell the difference. Yeah, so because of that, we can infer. This becomes more difficult as the system we're trying to infer whether or not it's conscious becomes more and more remote from us. So for a bee, it's not a mammal, it's already much more difficult. For a single cell like an amoeba, more difficult, let alone for an engineered system like a cerebral organoid or a large language models. It becomes effectively impossible. And we need a scientific theory of consciousness to tell us whether, in which condition a cerebral organoid, let alone an LLM, is conscious.
Right. Well, you've been at this a long time, Christof, but I'm amazed at how many books are being written about consciousness. In the 90s, when you and Francis Crick started this whole thing, that was not an acceptable area to be writing scientific papers about. Walk us through a little bit of that history.
Yeah, so as you point out, in the 1980s and 90s, there was this phase, this really deep-seated phase that, well, clearly physicalism has won. Materialism that sort of in the 20th century was called, and physicalism has won. That basically, all of Western philosophy of mind really revolves around the two twin poles of the physical and the mental, right? And these go all the way back to the ancient Greek, like Democritus, the atoms and the void. So everything is physical. And consciousness has to somehow arise out of physical. This is what most mainstream philosophers at the time thought, and certainly all of analytic philosophers, in particular people, like the Churchlands, like Daniel Dennett, and other people. But then, of course, the challenge is twofold. On the one hand, what is the physical? And of course, is dark matter physical? Is dark energy physical? We don't even know what that is. And what about, two entangled pairs of electrons that are half a light year away, and somehow spookily they're still connected. So what does it mean for the physical? And then when it comes to consciousness, physicalism has failed again and again to really explain it. What philosophers, analytical philosophers do, they say, well, sorry, Michael, you're just really confused. You're not in pain. There really isn't anything like pain. This qualia that some philosophers talk about, that's all baloney. That's hogwash. There really isn't. All there is sort of behavioral disposition that, you talk about your pain, you rub your jaw, you eat on the other side of the mouth. But this feeling, this bad feeling of this pounding toothache, that's just an illusion, or more correctly spoken, a delusion. Well, so, they sort of gaslight us into accepting that, oh yeah, I guess we're all totally confused about it. It's like we all have this illusion. It doesn't make the pain go away. And then people say, well, that's an adequate explanation. Well, that isn't an explanation of anything. Just telling me, sorry, it doesn't exist. It's not an explanation. And so consciousness has refused to be cancelled. And so now it comes back because of this failure of physicalism to account for it. People try to link it in all sorts of ways. Maybe physicalism is wrong. Maybe we have to go back to idealism. Maybe there's even this older and fainter voice of panpsychism. Maybe consciousness is right there at the bottom already with, elementary particles and fields. Maybe all of them feel already a little bit like something. So that's why there's a lot of churn in the academia of people who think about consciousness, trying to look for a new solution to this age-old problem.
Yeah, I was just writing about some of this, looking up on just Wikipedia of the number of different theories of consciousness. Just the Wikipedia page has 22. No, this is a paper by Anil Seth and Tim Bain when they review 22 different theories of consciousness, including higher order theory, self-organizing meta-representational theory, global workspace theory, integrated information theory, information closure theory, dynamic core theory, neural Darwinism, predictive processing. Anyway, the list goes on and on. You know these. My point is that if in cosmology we had like 22 different theories of the origins of the universe instead of the Big Bang, which won out over the steady state, I would think, well, there's something wrong with this science. They need to do something completely different.
Well, why don't you go to the webpage on quantum mechanics, interpretation of quantum mechanics?
That's true.
I think the last time I checked, there were like 18 different.
That's true. I forgot about that. Yes. Okay. Right. But what does that tell? What does that tell an outsider of what's going on in the field?
Well, that the community has not settled on a even nearly unanimous solution, that this problem is, that it's obviously a completely unsettled problem. Now, by the way, when people are very loose and goosey when they say theory, some people call a theory, well, I think it's this neuron. Well, that's not really a theory. That's a hunch. That's a hypothesis. It may even be true, but, a theory needs to be a small set of sort of axiomatic statements from which you can derive everything else. But that criteria, there, maybe 2 or 3 really true theories of consciousness around. But none of them, I agree, none of them is accepted, partly because we still don't have the tools to really dig into and go to the circuits of the brain to manipulate them. Because ultimately, any theory of consciousness has to start with you and I. Because, we can infer that other animals are conscious, or maybe, maybe even bees or single cells. But ultimately, the one test case that more or less almost everyone agrees to is humans and their brain. It seems to be closely associated with the brain, not with the heart, as most cultures believed, of course.
Are you proposing a return to 19th century introspection as a legitimate means of research?
That's a very good question, and the answer is yes. Because finally, particularly if you have these extraordinary experiences that people can report, near-death experiences, mystical experiences, religious conversion experiences, psychedelic experiences, they can completely disconnect you from the world, right? Like in a near-death experience, there may be no external world anymore apparent for you, right? You don't see or hear or feel anything. There may be no time. Time can come to a still where it's not too fast or too slow. It just is. There may be no space. And then people have, terror or awe or ecstasy, or they hear a voice, or they encounter something that needs to be taken seriously, in particular if more than one person reports it. And that is the primary fact that we need, those subjective experiences, because they're subjective. Ultimately, you have this experience. I can believe you because I know other people also have similar experiences, but if I don't have that experience, I have to take it as an act of faith. But then using scientific objective tools to try to explain these subjective feelings. Yes.
Yeah. So you open the book here. I'll just read this little passage here because it's a gripping opening. Within seconds, my entire field of view becomes engulfed by dark, swirling smoke. The space around me fractured into 1,000 hexagons and shattered. The speed with which this happened left no time to regret the situation I'd gotten myself into. As I was sucked into a black hole, my last thought was that the dying of the light, I too would die. And I did. I ceased to exist in any recognizable way, shape, or form. No more Christof, no more ego, no more self, no memories, dreams, desires, hopes, fears. Everything personal was stripped away. Nothing was left but a non-self. This remaining essence wasn't man, woman, child, animal, spirit, or anything else. It didn't want anything, expect anything, think anything, remember anything, dread anything, but it experienced. Did it ever? Okay, then you go on a little bit more about this. This is your DMT trip you tried as sort of a N of one experiment in consciousness exploration. Tell us a little bit about that and why you did that.
Well, because I heard a lot about these near-death experiences, and I wanted to, take no one else's word for it. Right, the motto of the Royal Society. Right, you have to, and with consciousness means you have to experience these things yourself, and that's why I've always been in pursuit of such experiences. This was early on during the pandemic, and I happened to know someone who offered me some whiff of, it's actually not DMT, it's something related. It's called the toad. And yeah, it's just extraordinary with 3 or 4 breaths, literally. That's what it took, 30 seconds. And then exactly what happens, what I described. And then, 10 minutes later by the lab, by the objective time, sort of you begin to know the you, my case Christof, sort of begins to come back, and you begin to sort of become aware of the world while you were sitting there for the last 10 minutes with eyes wide open, being in this highly altered state. It's quite remarkable, and then, it takes you several hours to recover. And then, of course, you think about it for every day for the, in my case, over the last 4 years. Because it brings home the primacy. At that point, there was no world. There was simply no world for me. There wasn't even a self. So even what some people call self-consciousness, particularly in us adults, the ability to think about ourselves, to know that I'm conscious, was gone. But what there remained was, this non-dual thing, this experience. So that's why we really, to want to explain consciousness, you have to start from consciousness. You have to start from this brute fact that what exists in this case, and this is absolute existence for itself, not relative existence for others. You have to start with such experience.
Yeah, so I guess that brings up the question, what does it mean to exist? Or, this book is a physical thing, it exists, but this experience
but it doesn't exist for itself, Michael. It only exists for you and for I and for others. Right? In fact, physics has difficulty describing this book, and it has difficulty describing where's the border between this book and the surrounding air in my hand. This takes a conscious creature who knows about hands and books and other objects to differentiate them. This is what Immanuel Kant talks about. This is not in the world. This is in your mind. The ability to locate things in space, to locate them somewhere, sometimes in time, to differentiate them, to say this book is associated with this hand and there's this causal relationship. My hand can move the book. None of that, this is famously what he called the thing in itself, das Ding an sich. That's all in your mind. That requires a conscious entity. And here existence is simply the fact that there is this conscious experience. And it exists absolutely. It doesn't depend, at that point, it doesn't depend on anything else. It's just me, or whatever remained of me. And that's different from this lesser form of existence for others. In this case, existence means causal power. It has causal power. This thing has a little bit of causal power. Gravity has causal power. Charge has electric power. My brain has a causal power upon itself. And this particular theory that I write about in the book, Integrated Information Theory, essentially says that consciousness ultimately is causal power upon itself. You take a system, any system like a brain or anything else, and you can sort of ask, can it be an agent of change? If it's in a particular state, can it determine its next state? Or can it, where it was in the previous state, a moment ago, where will it be in the next state? And to the extent that it has this ability, and the brain, of course, has an enormous amount of causal ability. If you're in this state, where am I? Where's my brain the next second, or the next 10 seconds, or the next 100 seconds? And that's what the theory says is what consciousness is. Nothing but causal power of a system upon itself.
Okay, but if in a counterfactual you removed all sentient beings from the universe, there would still be planets and stars that are really out there.
No, there would be stuff. There would be quarks and, whatever, membranes or superstrings, whatever people think the ultimate constituents are. But to see a black hole or to see a planet, you need a conscious entity who learns to differentiate the planet from its surrounding space, from its surrounding moon, and to differentiate that. That is an operation, that's a mental operation that takes place in the mind of someone like you or I, or maybe even a monkey or something, or another intelligence. Without consciousness, so it's interesting because people think of us, if there's ever going to be some sort of Armageddon, let's say an AI Armageddon, all of us disappears. Yeah. The world is exactly like this, but only without us. No, if there is no one around to see the trees and the leaves anymore and to differentiate the leaves from the trees, then it's just elementary stuff.
Well, but if in that scenario we all just suddenly disappeared, it's not like the trees would dissolve into quarks.
No, but there isn't anyone to see that there is a tree.
Well, no, I'm not talking about seeing it. I mean, just the trees that are actually just there. What happens to them?
The stuff. Well, no, but Michael, a tree is for you and I a very well-defined entity, right? Because we grew up with trees. We hug trees. We can carry parts of trees. We know what a tree is, right? If you remove all of that, if you assume all conscious entity are gone, then yes, the physical stuff that makes out the universe is still there. That doesn't depend on you and I. But the fact to say that there's a tree in its leaf, etc., that requires a mind. Without a mind, none of that exists. It's just undifferentiated stuff.
Yeah, okay. I call this the weak consciousness principle. You have to be conscious to experience consciousness. This was in response to our mutual friend Deepak Chopra, who says consciousness is fundamental and without cause. It is the ground state of existence. As conscious beings, humans cannot experience, measure, conceive of reality devoid of consciousness. But the hard consciousness principle is that without consciousness, the stuff can't exist. Not the elementary particles, but trees, planets,
it doesn't exist
moons.
as plant. Yes, that's correct.
I just don't see it, Christof. I mean, again, we're just all of a sudden disappear. The moon is going to still be there going around the Earth.
The elementary yeah, but what defines the moon? What makes a moon different from the very weak atmosphere that surrounds it? What makes a moon different from Earth? It takes an intelligence to say, well, because of their causal relation and the relatively low, high binding and gravitational binding energy of the moon, it's a different system from the Earth, right? All of that takes someone who looks at it and perceives it. It takes an entire apparatus to perceive that. Without anything like that around, it's this philosophical chestnut, right? What sound does a tree, or a single clapping hand, or what about the sound that a tree makes when it falls? If there's no one around to hear a tree fall, then literally, when it falls, stuff happens again, physics happens, but not a tree falling.
Yeah, so there it depends on how you define a sound. If a sound is bouncing off an eardrum, well, and there's no eardrums, then it doesn't make a sound. But if it's just air vibrating, then there is a sound.
Well, no, but even to say air vibrating, this requires a separation between the air and the body that generates it, and that separation again presupposes someone who says, okay, here is an object, a tree, and this tree generates, is a causal actor necessary to generate these vibrations in the air. But that is, things like causality are categories of the mind and not in the world. They are categories that our minds use to infer things about the world. I mean, Immanuel Kant, couldn't have been clearer than this. Space, time, causality, those are all categories. They're in our mind and not in the world.
Okay, so the formulas that astrophysicists use to describe what happens when a large enough body begins to experience fusion and it becomes a star and generates it under heat and pressure and so on. Okay, the equation, the Newtonian equation, whatever the equations are, I mean, they're not in the stars, they're in our heads, but they're describing something that's really out there. I guess I'm asking the kind of the fundamental nature of mathematics. Is it something you discover that's really out there, or is it entirely in our head? I'm going to guess you're going for the latter.
Well, I mean, you can be Penrose and assume, they have their own Platonic existence, or you could say, no, ultimately, yes, all of that are constructs of the mind. Look, I don't deny there's an external world. I study it in forms of the brain. But all I'm saying, that external world is totally dependent on, or the classification of the world, identifying the brain, which is different from the skull, is inside the skull. All of that requires conscious entities like you or I or some other conscious entity. And without those, none of that exists. Without that, all the world is just dust, essentially, ontological dust.
Okay. Have you sent Deepak a copy of your new book? He's going to love this book. He didn't blurb it. I don't think he blurb. No, he didn't blurb this one. Yeah.
I didn't ask him.
I don't know, Christof. I don't know. That goes a little farther for me. I mean, just think, let's come at it a different way. There's brain and mind. Okay, I tend to just think of, there's just a brain, and the word mind is just a word we use to describe what the brain does. Maybe you call that functionalism. Are you arguing in a dualistic sense that there's something that's mind somehow separate from brain, or a different category?
I have studied brains for the last 40 years. I can assure you, inside the skull, it's dark. There's no light inside, Well, I'm not trying to be funny. I'm trying to make a point that I see you and you're not as dark. And so obviously it's radical different from my brain. In fact, I didn't even, I have no prior knowledge of my brain. The brain is something that I infer. I go to medical school. I went to medical dissection, and all of that. I don't know. I mean, no one knows because you don't directly feel your brain, right? In fact, for thousands of years, people thought, their mind actually is associated with the heart. So the brain, I would say, is a substrate, is a physical substrate of the brain, of the mind, and without the substrate, the mind isn't there. At least my human mind isn't there. It depends on my brain. But they're two very, they on the face of it, they're radical different. They have radical different properties.
Well, the analogy, I think Deepak probably makes this about the radio signals that are coming into the room here.
Yes.
That are invisible. They don't exist until I turn on the radio. You need the radio to hear them, but they're out there anyway. And are you arguing something like that? Consciousness, you have to have the brain to perceive consciousness, but it's separate from brains.
It's different. Yeah, but I'm not arguing this. The radio hypothesis goes back to William James and even earlier. I don't argue that. I don't believe that my thoughts come from sort of the somewhere in the ether. My thoughts seem to be closely tied. Well, they aren't tied to anything in space, of course, my thought. But I know if I lose a particular bits and pieces of my brain, and sometimes very specific ones, or like in schizophrenia, right? When the brain overall seems to be intact, but particular circuits are different, and now people really have very odd thoughts. So clearly it seems to be very intimately linked to the not only to the general brain, but to very specific circuits in the brain. So that's what we know empirically. And we can begin to manipulate those circuits, at least in animals like mice. And so we can begin to understand the specific link between the brain and the mind. But the mind is something fundamentally different. The brain doesn't hurt. It's your mind that hurts. And in fact, you can show this because, there are all sorts of techniques where, like say deep meditation techniques, or there are these dramatic images of self-immolation of monks who sit there perfectly still while they burn to a crisp cinder, right? So clearly that tells you that mind is able to control pain to an extraordinary degree, to a degree that's sheer unbelievable. And, it's difficult to believe that this is for real, but we have lots of evidence for that. So again, the mind is different from the brain. Yes, it's closely linked, but it's different from. Now, it doesn't have to be dualism. There are all sorts of other ways you can think about it. So, all philosophy of mind is sort of always oriented towards the two poles, the physical and the mental, right? And so classical physicalism says only this pole exists, everything else is illusion. Idealism says, well, really only the mental exists. In fact, the physical world ultimately is a manifestation of the mental, which is now, by the way, has a resurgence. Have you come across this philosopher and computer scientist Bernardo Kastrup?
Yeah. I know him. Yeah.
Okay, he's a great. Have you had him on your show?
Yeah, he was on the show. Yeah, he's a super interesting guy. He's a big thinker.
Yeah, so for example, his theory is radical, it's really a return to Arthur Schopenhauer, mid-19th century German idealist, that ultimately what exists is not matter. Matter is a manifestation of the mental. Ultimately what exists is all mental. And the challenge for idealism is to explain, if there is this universal mentality, why don't I have access, why does my mentality not access your mentality? And it doesn't appear to be, right? I don't know what you're thinking. I'm not privy to your conscious experience, and you're not privy to mine. So that's the challenge that idealism has. But it's interesting that the field is so unsettled that things like idealism are making a return, or panpsychism that says at the bottom everything is in-minded, right? Everything, even elementary particles or fields, feel already a little bit like something. because classical physicalism has failed in explaining how the mind is supposed to be identical with the brain. Well, it's not. Yeah. Obviously, it's not.
Yeah, I had Philip Koch on the show talking about panpsychism. But again, I had David Chalmers on the show talking about, are we living in a matrix, virtual, I think the book was on virtual ethics or something like that, digital ethics, in that world. Is there any way to test it, that we're living in a matrix? No, he says, or a simulation. So at some point, this sounds like metaphysics or, philosophy, but not empirical science. I guess what I want to ask is, how would you test any of these ideas? So to find out if something's true, we have to have some sort of external validation. Otherwise, it's just you in your head and me in my head, and we all have our feelings and opinions or whatever. The example I use is, again, back to Deepak, when someone says meditation works for me, okay, good for you. But what someone like Deepak wants, he wants to say, no, it doesn't work just for me. It works for lots of people. And here are the conditions. And, 20 minutes a day, 7 days a week, under these conditions, 20 minutes, whatever. These are the mantras, and you do this and that. And it objectively reduces blood pressure and stress hormones and migraine headaches and whatever. Okay. So there he's making the shift from internal to external by actually collecting data. So analogously, on your trip taking the toad, or someone who takes ayahuasca, which I've been invited to do, I haven't done it yet. And I'm traditionally a materialist, but let's say I do this and I come back and go, oh my God, I went to this other place and it's incredible. There's this whole other world. It's really out there, in a completely different dimension, or whatever I would describe it as. And somebody says, well, what's the evidence for this? Well, here, take the ayahuasca or the toad or the DMT and you'll see it yourself. Isn't that still in your own head, and it's not external validation?
It's a very good question. So therefore, you need a theory that makes prediction that you can actually test. You need one of these theories that's sort of not just a standard physicalism or standard materialist account, but that actually explains both the phenomenology, how particular experiences feel, and their substrate. And this is what IIT tries to integrated information theory, by Giulio Tononi tries to accomplish. Starting with consciousness, it makes some very specific prediction about the wiring in the brain necessary, including it makes prediction, for example, for pure presence, right? That the state of pure presence, this sort of weird, I've never been in it, long-term meditators can get to the state where they have no thoughts, no percepts. They just sort of, the only thing apparently they're aware of is sort of this vague luminosity throughout the entire field. And it comes with all sorts of supposedly beneficial advantages if you can achieve the state of pure presence. That actually seems to correspond to a brain that has almost no activity, where you can see in EEG no deltas, in other words, they're not asleep, but also very little gamma activity compared to all forms of other meditation. So again, this theory makes some very specific prediction to your point. So it just doesn't depend on, well, I had this wonderful trip and this is my insight. And by the way, to channel Bernardo Kostrop, what is simpler? So the standard idea is, well, it's all physicalism, it's all, just matter, and brain is matter. But the fact is, the only thing Schrödinger and lots of physicists have pointed this out again and again. The only thing that I, as an observer, have access to, I don't access atoms, right? I don't even access a voltmeter. All I see is on a device like a voltmeter on an oscilloscope, I see something and I interpret that. So the only fact I know about the world is feelings, is mental, is phenomenology, is perception, right? So isn't it more natural to say, well, ultimately the only thing exists is just this mental stuff, all the way to the horizon and beyond, rather than going the much more difficult and saying, well, you're really confused. What really exists is this physical stuff, and then denying that there is anything truly mental there. I mean, that just has it all backwards. And we've been conned into believing that this is progress.
Okay,
denying the most obvious thing in the world, which is sort of gaslighting me into saying, well, sorry, there isn't anything to explain there. Your mind doesn't really, your conscious feelings don't really exist.
Oh, I lost you there for a second. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, in a way, it's okay. It's not dualism. It's monism. It's mental monism rather than material monism.
Incorrect. Idealism, I mean, and IoT isn't sort of, IoT doesn't really fall squarely. I mean, that's a challenge. I talk a lot about integrated information theory, and people always ask, well, is it idealism, or is it panpsychism? Is it physicalism? What is it? Well, it's a specific theory that makes specific assumption. It doesn't easily fall. It assumes there's consciousness, which is, intrinsic causal power. But it also assumes there are external things that have external power, like gravity and Maxwell laws, etc. So, but it's not like dualism either. So, a scientific theory, or look at quantum mechanics. I mean, that's not standard physicalism, right? Because it has these very non-local aspects of realism there, right? So, once you have a scientific theory, we have to be prepared to go away from these simple categories that people have devised over the last 2,400 years to come to grip with this world we live in.
Yeah.
But Heisenberg uncertainty relationship, that's something that isn't really straightforward and materialistic.
Right. Okay, during your experience, did you sense that there, I don't know how to ask it, there's other dimensions, or that the universe or the world is not what we actually think it is, and this is opening, say, the doors of perception, to use Huxley's phrase, or something like that? It's a tool to access a different part of the world?
Doing other experiences, no, not, I mean, doing this near-death experience that I'm never going to repeat, no, there
Really?
was just nothing. Well, yeah, because it was totally terrifying. I mean, if you lose suddenly everything, including yourself and your memories and your thought and space and time. I mean, space had collapsed at the singularity and time was totally gone. Yes, it's extremely. I mean, that's why I had this terror but also the ecstasy, the awe. But as you mentioned, in other states, let's say associated with an ayahuasca ceremony, you can get into these more, what Huxley describes as mind at large, where you feel you're tapping into this universe. It's very difficult to put it into words, some sort of universal mental entity that may be very primitive. It's not, you're not accessing the mind of a God that's like you or I, but you seem to access something way above and beyond of anything else that you've encountered, and you become sort of, you fuse with it, right? You lose the border between you and the rest of the world, and that's the title of my book.
Yeah.
Then I myself and the world, because that's sort of the way you experience this.
Yeah. Well, but as you know, a lot of people that have NDEs and other powerful anomalous experiences like that really do feel like they don't have to worry about death in the material world and all that. It just seems to dissolve away a lot of the normal material anxieties we have.
Yeah, so that's also my experience. And so what my particular experience, the one you read, it totally caused me to lose. As I got older, naturally, when you can't sleep as well, you begin to wonder, and you lie in bed and you think these totally useless thoughts, but somehow you can't stop yourself, right? Thinking about it, what happens, when you're dead, and for a truly long time, and you look into this existential abyss, and you get this existential vertigo. But after my experience, just totally gone, completely gone. So yes, it is true that after some of these experiences, you can totally lose any sense of, your fear of death.
Yeah, so maybe the microdosing movement to treat depression and PTSD and so on may also be a way of dealing with the anxiety of death, which is one theory about, I think Sue Blackmore talks about that one thing NDEs do is they, maybe it's the brain's way of transitioning you from life to death without being anxious about it.
Yeah, but let me just point out, this is not microdosing, right? Microdosing by definition means you don't have any acute effect. That's that's what classical microdosing. So typically, in order to get to this experience, if you want to do it using drugs, you have to go to relatively large doses of drugs. They're perfectly safe from a physiological point of view. But if you want to encounter these outer reaches of human experience, yeah, you got to be prepared to be strapped to a rocket and be completely helpless in the face of it, because once you hit the go button, there's nothing that can stop, and you just shouldn't fight and just abandon yourself to this particular experience and where it takes you.
Yeah. Yeah, but the sense that most people that have NDEs have is that their consciousness, their self, floats off the connectome and into the quantum field, or who knows wherever they go, and that it's a greatly relaxing, anxiety reducing experience.
Yeah,
good. But is there actually a place where the consciousness goes?
Michael. I've talked to many people.
I mean, that's in a way
a conference with an NDE. I've talked to no one says relaxing. I mean, these are the classical NDE occur, of course, as due to cardiac arrest or on the battlefield or near drowning. So there's nothing pleasurable about it. What is remarkable, as you point out, that despite you might think if you it's estimated 10 or 20% of people with cardiac arrest in the hospital that are rescued have an NDE. And what's remarkable, this is the data from Lomo, who did these surveys in Holland in cardiology. And what's remarkable about him, you might imagine this would leave a profound PTSD, right? You've just almost died, you probably were in extreme pain. But what's so remarkable that 80%, not all, but 80% of people who have an NDE describe it as life-affirming and meaning-giving. It's not relaxing. No one ever used the term, this was a relaxing experience.
But it's a profoundly positive experience in the long run.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I call them, there's this entire class, people have different names. They call them quantum changes, peak experiences, transformative experiences, religious conversion experiences. These are experiences, some of them happen under extraordinary circumstances like near death. Some just happen to people. You can read them over when they're walking about in the countryside. They see a sunset and suddenly, boom, they have this fantastic experience where they realize they're part of something whole, and then they change their life, right? They stop doing, one job or do something that's much more social or much more oriented towards the community or giving back or something like that. So there's lots of evidence that people can change, sometimes dramatically, due to very short-lasting episodes. All of these last well under an hour. They're all involuntary. In other words, you cannot really control them. But the experience themselves can often be terrifying, but they're highly meaningful.
Yeah. You have that passage from Jane Goodall talking about a flow experience, being out in the jungle with the chimpanzees and so on. And you've had something like that with your rock climbing, right?
Yep. And have you ever had it in your days when you were long distance biking?
Oh, totally. Absolutely. I would just zone out and be, in flow with the body, with my body, the bike, the environment. I mean, it's one of the reasons I like doing that kind of exercise, because I like the sun, the wind, just kind of being outdoors with nature, the ups and downs of the mountains. And hiking, I also enjoy just for the same reason. I like scenery going by and, I don't know, just kind of flowing into nature, something like that. I will often just go for hours and not even remember where I was or how much time passed. I mean, this doesn't happen every day, but but it has happened. Yeah. So that's an experience.
So I think what's so positive or what's sort of so addictive about it is that it takes you out of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So I think all of these transformative experiences, one of the key elements is you lose a sense of self.
Yeah.
And that can be incredible, but now you can just look at the beauty of nature if you're outside and just appreciate it for what it is without constantly, how does this profit me? How does this involve me? What do I have to do here?
Well, that's the basis of Decker Keltner's book, Awe. And, to experience awe, pretty much it's just losing your ego. And there's just lots of ways to do it, but basically just going outdoors or looking up or out to the clouds or up in the mountains, just something that's not just sort of mundane, normal business, traffic, cars, office buildings.
Yes, and some subset of those awe experiences, they can then lead to these transformational experiences where people then say, okay, this means I should really change my life fundamentally and do something else with it rather than chasing the almighty dollar.
That's all good, but that's still within ourselves. Okay, so when I talk to Christians, for example, about the afterlife, And I tell them, Jews don't believe in the afterlife, and it's, it's just a kind of a metaphor. It's a literary truth or a mythical truth. Jesus said, heaven is within you. It's not here. It's not there. The kingdom of God is inside you, but they're not buying that. They're like, no, 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 no. We believe it's a place you actually go to. And that's what most people think when they have NDEs, like Eben Alexander, who I know, he thinks he actually went somewhere and he's going back there again when he's dead. Not just an internal nice story that makes us feel good.
I understand that's what many people believe. I find that extremely, even under idealism, right? If idealism is true, is everything, to think about it. If Bernard Kastrup or Schopenhauer are correct, then ultimately the only thing there is this pure mentality, which may in fact be very, very undifferentiated, very simple. And out of which, like, eddies as part of a flowing river, there's this eddy, and the eddy thinks it has its own existence, which it does for maybe an hour or something, but then of course it disappears and becomes part of the wider river again. This may be exactly the case of our mentalities for a while, for 100 years, which is nothing if you think about the infinity before and afterwards. We have this identity, and then we dissolve again, but we don't go. I mean, I agree with you. There's no evidence that we go to another place that has an X, Y, Z coordinate somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. But that's a different question from the question that we addressed before. To what extent is there only the physical, or to what extent? Because I mean, how do you explain these states of profound experience, where people bring back what William James says, this noetic quality, right? Either you can say, well, everyone is confused. They're all just completely confused about it. None of this is really real. They're all delusional. Yeah, you could say that. Logically, that's plausible. But if too many people report it, and if you self-experience it is, then if you're really a serious scientist, you have to reconcile sort of your own experience with what you know about what truly exists. And then you begin to see the naivety of sort of a simple, purely physicalist account, because it simply fails to account for all of that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you wrote about terminal lucidity in your book, because I was just at an event, one of these ideas conferences with Rupert Sheldrake this last summer. And he brought up terminal lucidity as evidence that, evidence of what? That mind extends beyond just ourselves. It's out there, and that you're connecting to it. Much like his earlier research about how, dogs know when their masters are coming home, and you can sense when somebody's looking at the back of your neck, because there's something actually interacting with your physical body, mind or consciousness, something like that. So to him, terminal lucidity is when somebody's just about to die, it all comes back, their memories, their language, and so on, because it's not in there. It's not in the wiring. It's out there, and the wiring is just needed to tap into it there, and just before they die, it comes rushing back in, something like that. How do you interpret terminal lucidity?
Yeah, I don't believe there's some sort of cloud computing where all my memories that I've ever had are in some gigantic digital farm. That's right, I'm backed up and I can access that. Look, I simply don't know. I had one personal experience of terminal lucidity with a close friend that died, and I've seen it reported in the literature, and I'm puzzled. I don't think there's a simple explanation. I don't really think his explanation is valid. Maybe I don't know, Michael. It's just a very puzzling phenomenon if we take it for real. How is it possible that a brain that sort of fought, over the last years, the ravages of Alzheimer or whatever else the person is dying from, and then for minutes or hours or maybe half a day, it can be relatively clear and lucid. Now, I don't know anyone, because obviously you can't really do experiment under these conditions. How lucid is it really? Are all the memories coming back, or is it typically just the oldest memory? Because we know those are the ones that are most deeply ingrained, that go to the childhood of that particular person. We don't know any of this, but there seems to be something special happening in some people. Now, it may be more common in most people, but because of the widespread use of opiates to reduce pain in the last days or hours of life, people may simply be not able to experience it because their brains are sedated to prevent pain.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like when I asked Deepak, where does Aunt Millie's mind go when it dies of Alzheimer's? And he said, well, it returns to where it was before she was Aunt Millie. Okay, but you're not saying that exactly. But still, it is a curious thing. If the neurons are dead, they're dying, plaques and tangles and so on, and the memories are stored in there, and the memories disappear, and the person's own selfhood disappears over the course of years, and you autopsy the brain, and it's just shrunk. In that terminal lucidity, where did that come from? It is weird.
It is weird that there are some strange things between heaven and earth, Horatio, that, right now we have difficulty explaining.
Come on, I thought you had the answer to this. Well, because you've done a lot of work with people in comas. Okay, so I think I told you this story before. My mother was in a coma. She had brain tumors and so on, long story. But basically she was out and they weren't going to bring her back. She wasn't going to come back, so they're going to pull the feeding tube and all that stuff. So we kind of watch her slowly disappear. But when I would hold her hand and say, squeeze my hand if you can hear me, Mom, she would squeeze my hand. And it's like, okay, so she's in there, or whatever that means. She is in there.
Well, that I know much more about. So in that case, we now know. So let's see, what happens if I go out now and get hit by a truck? All right, and I survive. Well, I get into the emergency room. They stabilize me. I'm put on a ventilator, okay? And then they contact my next of kin, and then they ask, Christof, can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you, they shine me a bright light, shine a bright light into my eyes. Can I track it, etc.? And they do this for a couple of days. And if for a couple of days I remain unresponsive, they do what's called, they talk together with my loved ones. They do what's called withdrawal of life critical care. Because, the argument is, there are all sorts of arguments why you do that, particularly in this country. But the idea is this a state I wanted to live in if I'm behavioral unresponsive, glaucoma scale 3 or 4 or 5, would I have wanted to, and they withdraw life critical care. Now, we do know that 20% of these people have what's now known as covert consciousness. This is now a new thing that's been studied over the last 20 years, where you can show, using a particular techniques, by the way, derived from integrated information theory. Essentially what you do, you knock the brain with a magnetic pulse called TMS. You equip you put EEG electrode onto the brain, and you measure the brain electrical response. A little bit like you take a bell, you take a hammer to a bell, and you listen to the resonances. And if the complexity of those resonances are high, it turns out the patient is actually conscious, but the patient is either doesn't hear you or doesn't see you, or is unable to signal because their motor cortex has been destroyed, or is cognitively so impaired that they don't know what to do. So it's 20% of these patients. And so it is possible that your mom was actually conscious, at least at times, but unable to signal because of her state. And so the idea is now to build devices that can routinely test for this, so we know when the patient is conscious, but behavioral unresponsive. Because right now, the way we measure consciousness in people, we just have to ask them, because we don't have yet a reliable tool that'll tell me, like a tricorder, that I can point at this patient and say, yep, this patient is conscious, but the patient just simply doesn't want to respond or can't respond. We don't have that. And so that's needed. And so again, we need this, by the way, when people say, you also made this comment, well, this is all metaphysics, the mind-body problem, ultimately, when does it turn into empirical science? Well, this is where consciousness hits the road of life and death decision. Because as you just said, with your mom, you're being asked as loved one to make a decision, should we continue or discontinue life-supporting care because we believe the patient isn't conscious. That is a life and death, question. You need answers under very, very difficult conditions. So this is where a theory that tells me, based on some simple principle, is this brain conscious or is this brain not conscious, really would be essential. And IIT, so there are these tests that people are now trying to do based on integrated information theory, so-called PCI, using TMS and EEG to test for the presence of consciousness in patients.
Yeah. Okay, well, that brings up the question of where memories are stored in the synaptic connections or sequences of connections. And therefore, if you copied the entire connectome, the equivalent of the genome for the mind, you would have the self. Okay. But let's think about that. Is that really you, memory self, your mem self? Is that really you? Or is it your point of view self, the you, Christof, looking out of your eyes from moment to moment to moment throughout your life? That's yourself, and that your memories are just part of that. But I guess it depends on how you define the self in terms of what you're copying and uploading to the cloud or whatever digital file is being held, and that's where your self goes.
Well, okay, so that's a very complicated question. So there's, of course, the experiential self. Right now, I'm talking to you, which is different from the autobiographical self. I know where I was born, I know where I work, I know what I had for breakfast, etc. There's also the embodied self, right? I can feel my body, my muscle move, etc. So how I'm going to do all of that. And then, of course, you have to ask the question, assuming I could do all of that and take all my brain and reconstruct it in a simulation up in the cloud, would that feel anything? And that relates to this question we haven't really come to what extent can a simulacra of a human brain feel like anything?
Yeah.
Right? And I think for principal reasons, and this includes LLMs, at least digital computers as currently construed, with their low connectivity compared to the vast connectivity of the brain, will never feel like anything. Yes, they can imitate us extremely well. LLMs are really getting very good, including the art, the cover of Skeptic magazine. But that's, of course, it's like it never gets wet inside a simulation simulating a rainstorm. You can write down the 10-dimensional Einstein fields equation for very large mass, like the one at the center of our galaxy, the black hole, and you can predict, you can simulate based on these equations that nothing, not even light, can escape, right, making it a black hole. But funny, when you turn on that computer simulation, no one is afraid, oh my God, if I turn it on, it's gonna suck me into it. People say, well, that's silly, it's just a simulation. Well, exactly, what's missing? What's missing is a causal power of mere computation to emulate the causal power of gravity. Same thing with consciousness. Yes, in the fullness of time, we'll be able to simulate an entire human brain and reconstruct it. And if the simulation is done correctly, yes, it'll begin to look like me and talk like me. I think in principle, at least, that's correct. But it won't have the same causal power of mind brain because it's all a simulation. So it will be a deep fake.
Right. And it wouldn't be you. I mean, if we scanned it
wouldn't be anyone.
It wouldn't be anyone. That's right. I mean, if we scanned you right now, super sophisticated fMRI, and copied your connectome and uploaded it into the cloud and slid you out of the MRI and said, you're now up there, you'd say, no, I'm not. I'm right here. I'm experiencing myself. I'm here. Unless you define. So I've read people that, well, we just have to have a new definition of self. There's more than one of you.
Well, then, of course, gives all sorts of rise to other logical problems. What happens if I make two copies? How do these two copies feel now?
Yeah.
That's why remember in the Star Trek Enterprise, the original copy always gets destroyed, right?
Right.
Because otherwise you have dozens of Captain Kirks around, and who wants to deal with the plot complications of that?
Well, there was an episode of The Next Generation where Riker had been copied accidentally, and he discovered the copy like 20 years later. And the original one that was left on the planet, or I guess the original one, never had a relationship with Counselor Troy, but the other one did. So he's like,
I see. Okay.
All right.
But I mean, I would submit, no, it's simply not conscious. It may be very smart. It's very good, maybe in imitating me, but it's ultimately, it's all about doing, but not being. Consciousness ultimately is a state of being. Look, when you have one of these NDEs, right, you're not doing anything. You're just sitting there, lying on the operating table or whatever. You're not doing anything in a conventional computational sense. Yet you're in this profound state where you have these very meaningful experiences. So consciousness is ultimately about being, while intelligence is about doing.
Yeah. But you talk about causal power. Would that be part of being?
Yes, it is causal power. Ultimately, it is causal power upon itself. Without that, there isn't anything. There's no being. That's entirely correct.
Yeah. So is there any way that you could test if an AI had, the lights were on, it was experiencing something inside?
You mean without a theory telling you?
Yeah.
No, because in my mind, if you're so it depends what your metaphysics is. The majority of scientists today are functionalists, and they say, yes, consciousness has a function, and once you mimic that function, whatever that function is, then that entity will also have everything that comes with that function, including conscious sensation. But I'm not a functionalist. I think a consciousness doesn't have a function. It's more a structure. I'm more a structuralist. It's a structure of causal power, of these intricate causal relationships. And so if you want to get consciousness, you have to build those causal structure. In principle, you can do that using neuromorphic computers or possible quantum computers, because they have this massive connectivity, right, because of their entangled states. But you wouldn't get it in a conventional digital machine.
Yeah. Okay, so causal power, agency, intention, goals,
yes,
and so on. Well, a single cell organism following a chemical gradient in a liquid medium towards some goal, the light or some chemical food it wants to consume, that's a kind of consciousness or sentience then, is it not?
Yeah, so it may well be, Michael, that consciousness extends maybe throughout the tree of life. Because if I look at the vast complexity even of a single cell amoeba, nobody's even modeled the 10,000 different species of proteins contained, or 8,000 different species of proteins contained in a single cell amoeba. So yes, it may feel an itsy bitsy like something to be that little bacteria, amoeba, a protozoa tumbling around in water. Yes, indeed. Again, it's very difficult to test. That's why we need a theory that ultimately it's got to be tested in us, where, you can do tests in us, you can ask people, you can manipulate their brains, etc., to test it. And then it's just like general relativity. Once you develop confidence in the theory, you then take it out and test it under more extreme conditions. That's what has to happen with consciousness in order to answer a question like, does it feel like something to be a single cell organism?
Well, part of the AI existential threat narrative is that computers or AI will want something, or it'll intentionally do something that we don't want it to do. But isn't that impugning it with these kind of causal agency powers that they don't actually have? Is that what you mean?
Well, two things. So So two things. Of course, you have people, certainly for the foreseeable future, you see it already in Gaza and in Ukraine, that will misuse AI for their own purposes. Yeah. And so there you can say, yes, this AI wants to kill people, but that's just because a human programmer had targeted it to kill people. Of course, you can also endow an AI with a particular goal, like maximize ROI, right? And if the AI learns that if it causes a war, and it can predict where the war will happen, it can somehow make money on the stock market. Again, it does it, but without wanting to kill. And it doesn't feel like anything. It's like the asteroid that hit us 65 million years ago, right? It wasn't evil. It's just gravitational laws that dictated that, it would collide with planet Earth. And, it happened to cause the demise of the dinosaurs, but it wasn't evil. So in that sense, I don't believe in an evil AI. I believe in people who are badly intentioned, who will misuse AI, including possible, causing threats to humanity itself, not just to other people, but to all of us. But that's not because of their conscience, but because of their intelligence or hyper-intelligence.
Right. Well, that's what Osama bin Laden did. But he got natural intelligence rather than artificial intelligence to do the killing for him.
Yes.
So the problem isn't those machines; it's the person behind them.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. All right, Christof, I know you've got a hard out coming out here. Just kind of a big picture question. You've been at this for a long time. I do wonder if there are, the Mysterian mysteries that they can never be solved, even in principle, or maybe we're just centuries away, or maybe we're just down the wrong pathway. Not just this problem, hard problem consciousness, but why there's something rather than nothing. What was there before the Big Bang? Is there a God? Does God exist? What do you mean by exist? Free will and determinism. Well, come on, it's like, what do you mean by free or volition? If we live in a material determined universe, how can you be free? Depends what you mean by these terms. And again, I've had all these people on the show arguing for determinism. They have great arguments. Arguing for free will. They have great arguments. It makes me wonder, well, maybe these are just not soluble problems.
Okay, there's no law in the universe that says that a problem like consciousness, if we just stick with that, will have a solution that's accessible, that's cognitive accessible to us, right? My dog, much as I love dog, doesn't understand the functioning of democracy or a stock market, right? It's just beyond him, and it may also be beyond us. But that's, of course, it's a self-fulfilling and defeatist argument. We can only try as best as we can. We have made progress on the neural base, on the footprints of consciousness. In principle, I see no reason with theories like IIT or other theories. IIT is probably not the last word, so the last word. We take it, we modify it, but as long as things are testable, we can make progress. So I think at least some of these questions, I agree, sort of understanding-wise, as anything other than nothing, that seems sort of even more challenging than the problem is how does mind come about in a presumably physical universe. But what better way there is than to think about these problems, right, and engage with people like you in an open-ended dialogue and see where this takes us and do experiments. I mean, that's a great joy.
Well, here's what I recommend, Christof. Have yourself cryonically frozen and come back 500 years from now. So this is how it turned out. I had no idea.
Yes.
It was that one that was the correct theory.
Yes, we may be in for a big surprise. I hear you. You're totally right.
All right, here it is. Then I Am Myself, the World. Christof, thank you so much for writing this and your books. All your work is fabulous. Glad to see you flourishing, doing well up in the Pacific Northwest. Did I read you live on an island now?
San Juan Island, yeah, just a little bit north of Seattle and just south of Vancouver Island. Yeah, there's a set of 120 little islands, and I discovered the beauty of it during the pandemic.
Oh, nice.
As long as you still have ferry service that gets you food and the other necessity. And Elon Musk that gets you Starlink.
That's right. Yeah, you can be anywhere now.
Yes.
And things are going well at the Allen Brain Institute. What are they working on now?
Yeah, they're expanding. We're now almost, soon will be 1,000 people. I stepped down from all executive duties last year. Well, they continue to focus on these very large projects like, there's a cell census trying to build. We know that there were hundreds of cell types in the brain of mammals. Well, it turns out the number for mice is 5,000 different types of cells.
What?
And to understand disease, a lot of them, this is going to be critical. And the number is going to be very similar for humans because, we're really quite similar, although our brains is 1,000 times bigger. So understanding that and then linking that to specific diseases like Alzheimer's or ALS, etc., will be critical. So the systematic mapping of all the cells and all the types and the connectivity and the genes that express their zip codes where they send that information, that's a very large project that's now being led here by Honghui Zheng at the Institute.
Nice. I'm counting on them to solve these problems before people like you and I hit the wall. These people say, don't you want to live 500?
Stay active, stay young, stay positive.
I know. Exercise, diet, not too bad. Oh, did I read in your book, wine is not such a great idea? A mental toxin?
No, we know this for several decades now.
I know.
Wine you should do in great moderation. Yes, it's unclear. There's a beneficial effect, but it's not. It may be on social that people tend to be more social.
Oh, and that's good.
When under wine rather than direct the effect of ethanol. Ethanol may simply be a toxic product, even in small doses.
That's right. All right, Christof, that's a good place to end. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks a lot, Michael, for having me.